how deep you can go with the lyrics. Yeah. What can you say that other people don't say?
It's only words, and words are all I have to love somebody the way I love you.
Barry Gibb once hinted at something that left fans wondering for decades, that his most tender ballads, songs like Words and To Love Somebody, were born from a love he could never forget. He never revealed who she was, but the truth is hidden in the music if you know where to listen. It wasn't about fame, it wasn't about money, it wasn't even about the Bee Gees' rise to global stardom. No, this confession was about something far more human, far more haunting, a private heartbreak that had followed him long after the world thought he had moved on. We know Barry as the soaring falsetto, the songwriter behind disco anthems that defined the 1970s. But before all the glitter, before the fever of Saturday night, there were ballads, words, to love somebody. Songs so tender, so piercing, that people swore they must have been born from real pain, and they were right. Because behind the music was a story Barry never fully shared, at least not until years later. A story of a love he lost, a love that slipped away long before he was ready to let it go. Fans always wondered, who was it? Was it a young romance, a hidden affair, or someone the world already knew? The truth is, Barry never named her outright, but the clues are there, tucked inside the lyrics and interviews, in the way he looked back at those early songs. And once you hear what Barry admitted, you'll never listen to those ballads the same way again. So what was this secret heartbreak, and why did Barry carry it for decades? You're watching RetroWaves, the place where the real stories behind the music finally come out. If you've ever felt the ache of a love you couldn't forget, you'll understand Barry Gibb's secret. So before we dive deeper, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss these untold stories. And if this opening already has you wondering who that lost love was, drop a comment below. We want to hear your guesses, because what you're about to discover isn't just about Barry Gibb, it's about how heartbreak can echo through music, shaping songs we still sing today. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Barry Gibb's story has always seemed larger than life. He was the eldest of the Gibb brothers, the natural leader, the one who carried the weight of their dreams when the world was still doubting, three kids from Manchester. By the time Barry was in his 20s, the Bee Gees had already written hits that would outlast them. Yet for Barry, the music was never just about chasing charts. It was about expressing something he couldn't say out loud. From the very beginning, his ballads stood apart. Words, To Love Somebody. Songs that didn't shimmer with disco lights or drive crowds onto dance floors. Instead, they whispered truths that came from somewhere much deeper. Fans noticed. People asked, who is Barry singing about? The Bee Gees' rise in the 1960s should have been a dream. They were young, ambitious, and destined for greatness. But behind Barry's smile, there was another story unfolding, one that never made the front pages. A story of a love he couldn't hold on to, no matter how badly he wanted to. In later interviews, Barry admitted that those ballads weren't just songs. They were confessions. They were the words he couldn't say directly to the person who inspired them. He described them as music pulled straight from heartbreak, music written at a time when he was carrying the weight of an unspoken goodbye. And here's the part that still leaves fans puzzled. Barry never named the woman. He never told the world who had left such an indelible mark on his heart. But every time he sang those ballads, it was as though he was reaching back through time, singing to her. The irony, the Bee Gees would go on to conquer the world. They'd become one of the most successful groups in history. But even in the height of fame, even surrounded by applause, Barry's most private loss still echoed in his music. So what was this lost love that shadowed his greatest songs? And why did Barry choose to keep her identity hidden, even while admitting the pain? Before the world knew the Bee Gees as the kings of disco, they were just three brothers trying to survive the grind of the 1960s music scene. For Barry, the eldest, there was a different pressure. He wasn't just writing songs for the group, he was shaping their voice, their future, their chance at escaping obscurity. But in those same years, while the spotlight was still dim, Barry experienced something far more personal, a love that arrived quickly, filled his heart, and then slipped away before he could fully understand why. We know from Barry's own words that by the time he was writing songs like Words and To Love Somebody, he was already drawing from a very real heartbreak. He admitted those weren't just exercises in melody, They were written because of someone he couldn't forget. The details remain mysterious. Barry, even decades later, would not say her name. Some biographers suggest it might have been a young romance from his days in Australia before the Bee Gees moved back to England. Others point to relationships he formed once the group started breaking through in the UK. But Barry never confirmed either way. What we do know is this: he was only in his 20s when he poured those feelings into music, and the pain was still fresh enough that years later, at 30, he admitted it hadn't gone away. Listen closely to those early ballads, and you can hear it: lines about love that was never returned, or a goodbye that came too soon.
But what does it bring if I ain't got you?
They're not the songs of a man imagining heartbreak. They're the songs of someone living it. The public didn't know it at the time, of course. They just thought Barry was a gifted songwriter who could tap into universal feelings. But for Barry, the songs were more than universal. They were personal, and as those songs rose up the charts, he must have wondered, was she out there hearing them? Did she know they were for her? By 1967, Barry had written a song that would become one of the most covered ballads in music history, "To Love Somebody." On the surface it was simple, an aching declaration of love, but listen closely, and it's almost too raw to be fiction.
To love somebody.
Barry himself later admitted that this was one of the songs born from the love he couldn't let go. He described "To Love Somebody" as being written for one particular person. It was for her, he once said. It was always her, yet he refused to reveal who her was. The lyrics don't sound like they're meant for a faceless audience. They sound like a direct message, pleading, vulnerable, full of longing. You don't know what it's like to love somebody the way I love you. These were not the words of a songwriter chasing a hit. They were the words of a young man writing his heart down in melody. Then came Words, a quieter, softer song, but just as powerful. Barry explained that it was about the things we never managed to say until it's too late. Once again, fans couldn't help but wonder, what exactly had Barry left unsaid? The Bee Gees were climbing fast, yet Barry's ballads stood apart from the glossy pop of the era. They felt lived in, and when people asked where that emotional weight came from, Barry gave only hints. He admitted the songs were tied to a love that didn't work out. He admitted he had carried that heartbreak into his music. But beyond that, silence. Some speculated it was a romance that ended because of the Bee Gees' demanding schedule. Others whispered that family disapproval or the pressures of fame got in the way. But these remain only rumors. The only confirmed truth is Barry himself saying that those songs were born from a love he never forgot. And as the Bee Gees began their rise, the mystery deepened, because while Barry was singing about heartbreak, he was also about to step into marriage. So how do you carry a lost love while promising yourself to someone new? In 1970, Barry Gibb married Maureen Bates, a relationship that on paper should have closed the door on past heartbreak. But in reality, the marriage was short-lived. The two divorced after just a few years, and Barry rarely spoke about it in detail. What makes this period so fascinating is how it overlapped with the most emotionally charged songs of his early career. Fans looking back now can't help but connect the dots. Was Barry already carrying a wound from a love he lost before Maureen? Did that unhealed pain make it impossible for his first marriage to survive? Barry himself never blamed Maureen, nor did he paint their time together in a negative light. But even he admitted that during those years, his heart was still somewhere else, and it shows in the music. While the Bee Gees experimented with new sounds, Barry's ballads kept returning to themes of distance, longing, and words left unsaid. It was as though, no matter what success came his way, he was still writing to one person, someone who was no longer by his side. The contrast became even sharper when Barry remarried in 1970 to Linda Gray, the former Miss Edinburgh. Their relationship was, and still is, one of the most enduring and stable marriages in rock history. Together, they raised 5 children, built a life far away from scandal, and gave Barry a sense of grounding. Yet even with Linda's steady presence, Barry never denied that some of his earliest songs were shaped by a lost love. He didn't try to rewrite history. Instead, he carried it quietly, almost like a secret chapter of his life that was locked away but never erased. For many artists, heartbreak becomes a fleeting muse. For Barry, it became the foundation of his greatest ballads. songs that still resonate because they came from a real wound. But here's the question that lingers. If Barry found lasting happiness with Linda, why did he still admit at 30 that those songs came from a love he couldn't forget? By the late 1970s, Barry Gibb was on top of the world. The Bee Gees had gone from balladeers to global superstars, riding the disco wave with Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, and How Deep Is Your Love. The spotlight was blinding, the fame overwhelming. But beneath the glitter, Barry was still carrying something private, something he finally put into words. In an interview around that time, when asked about the origins of his most heartfelt songs, Barry didn't dodge. He admitted openly that the ballads, Words, To Love Somebody, and others were born from a love he couldn't forget. He was only 30 when he said it, and fans were stunned. Think about that. At the peak of fame, with the world celebrating him, Barry looked back a decade and confessed that the pain of lost love was still there. That even as a husband and father, even as a superstar, a part of him was still writing to the one who got away. He didn't name her, he never would, but his words confirmed what fans had always suspected. Those songs were not abstract, they were lived. They were the sound of Barry Gibb bleeding onto paper. When he said those words, it came from a love I couldn't forget. It wasn't the statement of a man looking for headlines. It was quiet, matter of fact, honest, and yet that honesty only made the mystery deeper. Who was she? Was she listening when Barry's voice played through radios across the globe? Did she recognize herself in the lyrics, in the longing, in the heartbreak that millions of strangers were now singing along to? The truth has never been revealed. All that remains are Barry's words and the songs themselves, living proof of a love powerful enough to echo across decades. But here's the twist. Those confessions didn't weaken his legacy. They strengthened it, because suddenly fans realized that Barry's genius wasn't just technical, it was emotional. He wrote because he had lived it. And that raises the question, how do you carry a memory like that while building an entirely new life? What makes Barry Gibb's story so unusual is the balance he managed to keep. On one side, he carried the ache of a love that slipped away too soon. On the other, he built one of the most enduring marriages in music history with Linda Gray. From the moment they wed in 1970, Barry and Linda seemed untouchable. While other rock stars filled tabloids with affairs and scandals, Barry chose stability. Their marriage became a safe harbor, something rare in the music world. Friends often said that Linda was Barry's anchor, the reason he survived fame's chaos when so many of his peers didn't. And yet, even in that safe harbor, the echoes of his earlier heartbreak never fully faded. Barry never pretended otherwise. He admitted the songs came from that wound. He admitted it was real. But he also never allowed it to overshadow the life he built with Linda. This is where Barry's story becomes so deeply human. Because isn't that what love often is? We don't erase the past, we carry it. We grow around it. We remember someone who shaped us, even if they didn't stay. For Barry, those memories didn't destroy his future. They shaped it. They gave him songs that millions connected to, songs that outlived the moment that created them. And in Linda, he found a partner who seemed to understand that music would always hold pieces of the man he once was. It's almost as though Barry lived in two timelines at once, the young man who lost love and poured it into ballads, and the older man who found peace and family, but never denied where the music had come from. That tension is why those songs still cut so deeply today, because when Barry sang about love lost, he wasn't imagining it, he was remembering. But if the heartbreak stayed with him, did it ever resurface later in life, when he was older, when his brothers were gone, and he was left carrying the Bee Gees' legacy alone? As the years passed, Barry Gibb's life became a story of survival. He was the last brother left standing. Robin, Maurice, and Andy, all gone before their time. With every loss, Barry was forced to look backward, to carry memories heavier than any fame could balance. And in those moments of reflection, fans noticed something. Barry often returned to the early ballads when he performed alone, to love somebody. Words, songs written in his 20s, long before the Bee Gees became disco icons. It was as though those ballads were his truest voice, his private diary disguised as music. When he sang them later in life, his voice weathered by age and grief, the emotion felt even sharper. People in the audience said it was like watching a man sing to someone who wasn't there anymore. Not just to his brothers, not just to the fans, but to the one love he admitted he could never forget. Of course, speculation grew. Was Barry's lost love tied somehow to the grief of losing his brothers? Or was it a completely separate chapter of his youth? Barry never clarified. He kept the two truths distinct: the heartbreak that shaped his songs and the family tragedies that defined his later years. But the fact that he chose to highlight those same ballads decades later speaks volumes. He could have leaned only on the disco hits that made him rich and famous. Instead, he kept coming back to the tender songs born from pain, songs that outlasted the mystery of who they were written for. And maybe that's why audiences connected so strongly, because whether they knew Barry's secret or not, they felt the honesty, they felt the wound. Still, one question lingers. If Barry was willing to admit the heartbreak existed, why did he refuse to ever name the woman behind it? Was it to protect her, or because even after all those years, the memory was too sacred to share? The mystery of Barry's lost love has never been solved. Unlike many rock stars, he never turned it into gossip. He never cashed in on it, never let it become a tabloid headline. He carried it like a private scar, visible only in the songs, and that silence might be the greatest clue of all. Because what kind of love do you never name? Perhaps one that was too real, too fragile, too dangerous to expose to the glare of fame. Biographers have offered theories. Some suggest it was a romance from Barry's youth in Australia, a girl who stayed behind when the family left. Others whisper about an early London relationship cut short by the demands of the Bee Gees' career, but none of these theories are confirmed. They remain speculation, nothing more. Barry himself drew the line. He admitted the heartbreak. He admitted the songs came from her, but he would not give her identity away. And maybe that's what makes his music timeless. The mystery forces us to step into his shoes, to remember our own heartbreaks, our own unfinished love stories. We don't need to know her name, because in some way, she could be anyone. For Barry, protecting that memory was more important than satisfying curiosity. The proof was already in the music. He had said all he needed to say. Through melodies the world would never forget. But what happens when a secret like that becomes part of your legacy? By the time Barry reached his 70s, his songs had taken on new weight. He was no longer just the last Bee Gee. He was the keeper of every story, every melody, every heartbreak that had shaped the group's journey. And when he was asked about his ballads, he didn't change the story. He still admitted, even decades later, that they came from a real heartbreak. He still called it a love he couldn't forget. Fans who had grown up with those songs heard them differently now. Suddenly, they weren't just Bee Gees' classics. They were Barry's confessions, fragments of a love story the public would never fully know. It was both haunting and beautiful, because here was a man who had achieved everything: fame, fortune, a lasting marriage, children, grandchildren, and yet at the center of his art was still the ghost of someone from long ago. And this is where Barry's story touches something universal, because isn't that how life often works? You can move forward. You can build something new. You can even find joy. But some loves never fade. They become part of you, shaping how you see the world, how you create, how you remember. For Barry, that meant turning heartbreak into music that millions could sing. For the rest of us, it means hearing those songs and realizing we've all had a somebody we can't quite forget. But the real revelation was still to come. Because when Barry finally revealed just how deep that memory went, it became clear that this wasn't just a passing sorrow, it was the heart of his artistry. The moment came when Barry said the words that changed how fans heard his music forever. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize, he simply admitted, "At 30, I admitted this song came from a love I couldn't forget." It was an extraordinary confession, not because musicians don't write from heartbreak, but because Barry rarely revealed his personal life. He wasn't a man of scandals, he wasn't chasing headlines, which meant that when he finally spoke, people listened. Suddenly, To Love Somebody was no longer just one of the greatest soul ballads ever written. It was a letter to someone who had walked away. Words was no longer just a universal anthem, it was Barry's regret, the things he couldn't say until it was too late. Fans around the world replayed those songs, listening differently, as though decoding a secret he had hidden in plain sight for decades. And the more you listened, the more you realized he wasn't exaggerating. These weren't polished illusions, they were scars. For Barry, music had always been survival. When the Bee Gees faced rejection, he wrote. When fame consumed them, he wrote. When his brothers died, he wrote. But at the very root of it all was a young man who had once been broken by love and had never truly healed. That's what gave his voice its power. That's why his songs outlasted trends. Because behind the falsetto, behind the disco grooves, there was a man who once fell in love and lost and carried that truth into every note. The climax of Barry's story isn't just that he confessed the heartbreak, it's that he turned it into something greater than himself. He took his most private pain and gave it away to the world, trusting that people would understand, and they did. Because decades later, when Barry stood alone on stage and sang those ballads, entire audiences cried with him. Not for the woman he lost, not for the mystery, but because in his voice they heard their own. But if Barry gave the world his pain in song, what did he keep for himself? The answer is simple. He kept the name. He kept the details. He kept the love itself private, locked away, known only to him. And that choice tells us everything. Barry understood that some memories aren't meant to be shared. Some stories lose their meaning when exposed. By protecting her identity, he preserved the purity of what they once had, even if it was brief, even if it was painful. It also preserved the magic of the music, because without a name, the songs belong to all of us. Each listener can attach their own memory, their own heartbreak, their own lost love to Barry's voice. That's why the songs endure, not just because of who they were about, but because of who they allow us to remember. Barry himself found peace in later life. He often credited Linda with saving him, with grounding him through fame and loss. His marriage, his children, his career, all of it pointed to a man who built something lasting. But the fact that he still admitted those early ballads came from lost love shows how honest he was willing to be. And maybe that's the final lesson of Barry's story. You don't have to erase the past to move forward. You don't have to forget in order to love again. Sometimes the people who shape us most are the ones who leave too soon. Barry turned that truth into songs that still cut through time, songs that remind us that pain can become beauty, that loss can become legacy. So the next time you hear "To Love Somebody" or "Words," ask yourself, who do those songs bring back for you? Because Barry's muse will always remain unnamed, but yours doesn't have to. Barry Gibb once admitted that at 30, he was still haunted by a love he couldn't forget. Decades later, his songs still carry that ghost. And maybe that's why they'll never fade. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think of your own somebody, tell us in the comments. Whose memory does Barry's music bring back for you? And don't forget, you're watching RetroWaves. This is where the real stories behind the legends are told. Subscribe now and join us, because the next story might just reveal a truth you've never heard before. After all, music keeps secrets, and here on RetroWaves, we uncover them.